Little Johnny was sitting in class one day and the teacher was talking about life. She asks him, "Little Johnny, what do you want your wife to be like?" He, "Like the moon." The teacher, "That's such a beautiful answer because it's calm and peaceful." Little Johnny, "No, because it appears at night and disappears in the morning." 3 men met on a nude beach. 2 of the 3 men were happy, but the third was sad. The 3 men broke into a conversation. Eventually, they started talking about their jobs and why they were at the beach. "I'm a construction worker," said the first man. "All day long I toil in the hot, hot sun, and do so wearing very heavy clothes. It's quite exhausting. But here, I can relax, and do so without any clothing at all." "I'm an accountant," said the second man. "I just like how everyone here is dressed exactly the same." The first 2 men turned to the third, sad man. "What about you?" they asked. "Why are you here?" "My doctor sent me here," said the third man. "I'm a pickpocket." Once upon a time, there was a man who was peacefully driving down a windy road. Suddenly, a bunny skipped across the road and the man couldn't stop. He hit the bunny head-on. The man quickly jumped out of his car to check the scene. There, lying lifeless in the middle of the road, was the Easter bunny. The man cried out, "Oh no! I have committed a terrible crime. I have run over the Easter bunny." The man started sobbing quite hard and then he heard another car approaching. It was a woman in a red convertible. The woman stopped and asked what the problem was. The man explained, "I have done something horribly sad. I have run over the Easter bunny. Now there will be no one to deliver eggs on Easter, and it's all my fault." The woman ran back to her car. A moment later, she came back carrying a spray bottle. She ran over to the motionless bunny and sprayed it. The bunny immediately sprang up, ran into the woods, stopped, and waved back at the man and woman. Then it ran another 10 feet, stopped, and waved. It then ran another 10 feet, stopped, and waved again. It did this over and over again until the man and the woman could no longer see the bunny. Once out of sight, the man exclaimed, "What is that stuff in that bottle?" The woman replied, "It's hairspray. It revitalizes hair and adds permanent waves. My grandfather told me this one not long before he died." A man is in his boat out on the lake with a bucket full of fish that he had just caught. A wildlife officer spots him and pulls his boat up alongside. Seeing the bucket of fish in the man's boat, the wildlife officer asks to see his fishing license. The man tells the officer that he doesn't need a fishing license. The wildlife officer looks down at the bucket and says, "You definitely need a license to be catching fish. I can see that you've been fishing today. You have live fish right there." The man says, "Oh no. Those are my pet fish. I just brought them out here for the day to enjoy the lake." "Pet fish?" replied the wildlife officer. "Oh, absolutely. I let him out of the bucket and they swim around and play, but when I whistle they all jump right back in. They are very well trained." The wildlife officer scratches his chin, then says, "I've never heard such a, well, I've got to see this." The man dumps the bucket of fish into the lake, then calmly turns and looks at the wildlife officer. The wildlife officer says, "Well, call them back." The man says, "A call who back?" The wildlife officer says, "Your pet fish." "What fish?" replied the man. A mother and a son walk into a doctor's office. Because the son has been doing very poorly in his classes. The mother says to the doctor, "I think my son has become stupid." The doctor says in reply, "How do you suppose that would happen?" "I'm sure it had something to do with those vaccines he got last year," said the mom. "Ah, ha! That's it," said the doctor. "The vaccines caused it?" "No, it's genetic." Deborah is the office gossip, always ready to find dirt on her coworkers and spread it around the office. One day, on her lunch break, Deborah sees one of her coworkers' son sharing a meal with a woman who is clearly not his wife. Knowing that this could be the drama of the century, Deborah gets in her car and follows them to a house, then takes pictures of them kissing from between the blinds. Her break is long past up, so she returns to the office. As soon as she gets back, Deborah begins to stalk her coworker's son on Facebook. She quickly realizes that the woman in question is her coworker's husband's daughter, the son's stepsister. Deborah can't help herself. She prints out copies of her pictures and loudly brings them to her coworker's desk. She makes a great show of telling how it all went down. Her coworker listens patiently, then tells her, "Deborah, I don't know exactly what you're implying, but I'm afraid this is a family affair." A DEA officer stopped at a ranch in Texas and talked with an old rancher. He told the rancher, "I need to inspect your ranch for illegally grown drugs." The rancher said, "Okay, but don't go in that field over there," as he pointed out the location. The DEA officer verbally explodes saying, "Mister, I have the authority of the federal government with me." Reaching into his rear pants pocket, the arrogant officer removed his badge and proudly displayed it to the rancher. "See this badge? This badge means I am allowed to go wherever I wish. On any land. No questions asked or answers given. Have I made myself clear? Do you understand?" The rancher nodded politely, apologized, and went about his chores. A short time later, the old rancher heard loud screams, looked up, and saw the DEA officer running for his life, being chased by the rancher's big Santa Gertrudis bull. With every step the bull was gaining ground on the officer, and it seemed likely that he'd sure enough get gored before he reached safety. The officer was clearly terrified. The rancher threw down his tools, ran to the fence and yelled at the top of his lungs. A British SAS squad and an American Marines squad are together in the middle of a city. The commanding officers of each group are discussing the merits of SAS versus Marines. These officers have reputations for being the strongest, toughest, and most feared men in the whole of the armed forces. The American squad leader turns to the British officer and says, "My Marines are so much braver than your SAS." "I doubt that very much," says the SAS officer. "They are much braver," says the American. "Watch this." The American squad leader turns to one of his Marines and shouts, "Sergeant, climb to the very top of that building and jump off." "SIR, yes, SIR," shouts the sergeant. The sergeant runs inside the building, runs to the top and without a second's thought, jumps off the top of the building and smashes into the ground. He survives, but is very badly injured and gets taken away on a stretcher. The American leader turns to the SAS officer and says, "Now that's bravery." "Yeah, well watch this," says the British officer. He turns to his men and bellows at the top of his voice, "You, private, climb to the top of that building and jump OFF." The private looks at the officer and says, "Sir, go screw yourself, sir." The officer turns around to the American and says, "You see? That's bravery." A man who is driving a car is stopped by a police officer. The officer, "You were going at least 75 in a 55 zone." Man, "No sir, I was going 60. Wife, "Oh, Harry. You were going 80. Officer, "I'm also going to give you a ticket for your broken tail light." Man, "Broken tail light? I didn't know about the broken tail light." Wife, "Oh Harry, you've known about that tail light for weeks." Officer, "I'm also going to give you a citation for not wearing your seatbelt." Man, "Oh, I just took it off when you were walking up to the car." Wife, "Oh, Harry, you never wear your seatbelt." Man turns to his wife and yells, "Shut your mouth." Officer turns to the woman and asks, "Ma'am, does your husband talk to you this way all the time?" Wife, "No, only when he's drunk." 3 technicians go into an interview for a job at the local telephone company. They were all three great candidates and very well qualified. The boss brings them into the office and says, "Okay, you three look the best on paper, but I got to know if you have what it takes for the day-to-day work. So, I'm gonna give you 1 day to impress me, set as many telephone poles as you can and report back tomorrow." They all three go to work setting poles and return the next day into the boss office. The boss asks one by one how many they set. The first guy set 13, "Wow, 13, that is impressive," the boss tells him happily. The second guy set 9. "Well," said the boss, "not as good as the first guy, but still it is impressive." He turns to the third guy. "How many did you set?" The boss asks. 2, the man replies triumphantly, his blonde hair waving in the wind. 2. That's it? The manager was shocked. "That's barely any. What were you doing all day?" "Well, I didn't want to have to be a snitch, but these other guys? They only put theirs halfway in the ground." A blonde lived with 2 blonde roommates. She bought a new car, and on the way home from the dealer got caught in a terrible hailstorm. Her brand new car was dented all over. When she got home, she called the service department to ask what she should do. They offered to send the car to a mechanic, but she'd have to pay for it. She tells them she has absolutely no money. Couldn't they just send someone anyway? The service chief, being a prankster, told her to wait till the car was cool and then blow hard on the tailpipe, which would pop out all the dents. A half hour later, her roomies saw her on her knees behind the car, blowing as hard as she could. They asked what the heck she was doing and she told them, adding in a perplexed tone, "But it's not working." "You dummy," one of her blonde roommates said. "You have to roll up the windows first." A newbie hunter asked an experienced old hunter how to hunt bears. The old man answered, "It is easy, my son. I've hunted hundreds of bears in my life. You just need to grab your gun and take a ride to some mountains nearby. First, find a cave or stone cavern that might shelter a bear. Second, make some woo. Woo sounds so that the bear inside would mistake it as a signal of its companion. It should also make the same sound back at you. After it comes out, you just pull the trigger. Easy, right?" The newbie nodded and exited without coming back for months. After a long time, the old hunter saw that newbie on a street and found him crippled, with an ear lost and an eye blind. He asked him what happened. The newbie says, "I did as what you told me before. But god darn it, when something inside that cavern answered my woo. Woo, I didn't expect a train would come out and hit me." A young Mexican man named Jose was curious about America, so he saved his money and went on a trip. He wanted to go see a baseball game, so when he went home, he could tell his family all about it. When he got there, the game was sold out, so he decided to climb to the top of a flagpole to get a better look. When he returned home, his family was anxious to hear about his experience. "What happened?" asked his family. "Well, America is the nicest place in the world," he said. "Before the game started, all the people in the stands and all the players stood up, looked at me and shouted to me, 'Jose, can you see? A woman's garden is growing beautifully, but the tomatoes won't ripen.' She goes to her neighbor and says, 'Your tomatoes are ripe, mine are green. What can I do about it?' The man replies, 'Well, it may sound absurd, but here's what to do. Tonight there's no moon. After dark, go out into your garden and take all your clothes off. Tomatoes can see in the dark and they'll be embarrassed and blush. In the morning they'll all be red, you'll see.' She says to herself, 'Well, what the can't hurt to try it.' Next day her neighbor asks how it worked. 'So,' she answers. 'The tomatoes are still green, but the cucumbers are all 4 inches longer.'" A biology student doing his thesis on wasps is walking down the street when he passes a record store. In the window he sees a record called "Wasps of the World" and the sounds they make. Intrigued, he walks into the store. He says to the shopkeeper, "I'll have that wasp record in the window, please. I've been listening to so many wasps, I'll probably be able to know each and every one of them." He smiles smugly as the shopkeeper feigns interest. The student pays and leaves. When he gets home, he puts the record on. Busy it goes, but the man is stumped. He doesn't know what type of wasp this is. He waits for the next track. Busy and again, he can't identify which species of wasp this is. It gets to the 5th track and he breaks down. He can't identify a single wasp, yet he thought he was already an expert on the subject. He calls his professor round to the house to help. A priest and a nun are caught in a blizzard. They find a deserted cabin and take shelter, where they find a sleeping bag, a bed, and a pile of blankets. The priest, being a gentleman, offers the nun the bed and takes the sleeping bag for himself. As they get tucked in for the night, the nun calls out, "Father, Father, I'm cold." So the priest gets up and puts another blanket on the nun. "Is that better, sister?" he asks. "Yes, Father, much better," she replies. So he gets back in his sleeping bag and starts to nod off, when she again calls out, "Father, I'm still cold." So once again, the priest gets up and puts another blanket on her, ensuring she is tucked into the bed well. "Is that better, sister?" he asks. "Oh yes, Father, that's much better," she says. So the priest gets himself back into the sleeping bag and is just starting to dream when he wakes up to her calling out, "Father, Father, I'm just so cold." The priest thinks long about this and finally says, "Sister, we are in the middle of nowhere in a blizzard. No one but you, myself, and the Lord himself will ever know what happens here tonight. How about, just for this night, we act as though we were married?" The nun thinks about this for a minute. She can't help but admit to herself she's been curious, and finally answers, "Okay, Father, just for tonight, we will act as though we are married." "Great," the father replies. "Get up and get your own damned blanket," and rolls over to fall asleep. A mechanic was removing a cylinder head from the motor of a Lamborghini when he spotted a well-known heart surgeon in his shop. The surgeon was waiting for the service manager to take a look at his car when the mechanic shouted across the garage, "Hey, Doc, can I ask you a question?" The surgeon, a bit surprised, walked over to where the mechanic was working on the car. The mechanic straightened up, wiped his hands on a rag, and said, "So, Doc, look at this engine. I open its heart, take valves out, fix them, put them back in, and when I finish, it works just like new. So how come I get such a small salary and you get the really big bucks, when you and I are doing basically the same thing?" The surgeon paused, smiled, leaned over, then whispered to the mechanic, "Try doing it with the engine running." A new blonde stewardess began her first day. The route they were flying required that they make a stop in another city for the night. Soon after their arrival, the captain showed all the flight attendants to their rooms. The next morning, the pilot was preparing everyone to leave, and he noticed his new flight attendant was missing. He knew which room she was in at the hotel and called her up, as he was wondering what happened to her. She answered the phone, sobbing, "I can't get out of my room." "You can't get out of your room?" the captain asked. "Why not?" The stewardess replied, "There are only 3 doors in here," she cried. "One is the bathroom, one is the closet, and one has a sign on it that says, 'Do not disturb.'" A widower, on his retirement, purchased a house situated near a high school. He spent the first few weeks of his retirement in peace, then the new school year began. One afternoon early into the first semester, 3 young boys came down the street, beating merrily on every bin they passed. They did this the following day and the days after that, for a week, until the man decided it was time to take some action. The next afternoon, he walked out to meet the boys as they banged their way down the street. Stopping them, he said, "You kids are a lot of fun. In fact, I used to do the same thing when I was your age. Would you do me a favor? I would give you each $1 if you promised to come around and do your thing. The boys were more than happy to accept this and continued to bang the bins. After a few days, the man came out to meet them with a sad smile and said, "This recession really is putting a dent in my income. From now on, I will pay you each 50 cents to continue." The boys were unimpressed by this, but continued to do the same afternoon activities. A few days later, the man approached them again and said, "Look, the recession has again reduced my income, so from now on, I am afraid I can only pay you 25 cents each." The leader then exclaims angrily, "That's it? If you really think we are going to waste our time banging the bins for 25 cents each, you must be a fool. No way that's going to happen. We quit." The man then enjoyed peace and serenity for the rest of his days. Some time ago, a man had 2 sons. As they got older, everyone quickly realized that Jackson was very sharp, while Blake was about as sharp as a spoon. They were both loved very much and cared for. As time went by, the father got sick and eventually passed away. Jackson called his brother on the phone and told him, "Listen, I have an enormously important business meeting I must attend, but I will get on the first flight home. Here are my credit card details. Please make sure Dad looks his best and gets everything money can buy for his funeral, spare no expense." He wasn't sure this was a great idea, given that Blake was, well, Blake, but he had no one else to call. Surprisingly, Blake took care of everything and did it with a rather decent budget. Jackson was pleasantly surprised and the funeral went well, if a sad and emotional affair for all. A few months later, Jackson calls Blake again. "Listen," he says. "I don't want to make accusations or nothing, but could it be that you are still using my card for about $300 every month? I can see it here on my credit report." "Of course not," said Blake, insulted. "I would never steal from you, you know that." "Yeah, I do," said Jackson, "but how do you explain these?" "Oh," said Blake, "I bet those are for Dad's tux. You said you wanted him to look his best, so I rented the most expensive suit in town." A blind man enters a bar and finds his way to a bar stool. After ordering a drink and sitting there for a while, the blind guy yells to the bartender, "Hey, you want to hear a blonde joke?" The bar immediately becomes absolutely quiet. In a husky, deep voice, the woman next to him says, "Before you tell that joke, you should know something. The bartender is blonde, the bouncer is blonde, and I'm a 6 tall, 200-pound blonde with a black belt in karate. What's more, the fella sitting next to me is blonde and he's a weightlifter. The woman to your right is a blonde, and she's a pro wrestler. Think about it seriously, mister. You still want to tell that blonde joke?" The blind guy says, "Nah, not if I'm gonna have to explain it 5 times. An old cowboy sat down at Starbucks and ordered a cup of coffee. As he sat sipping his coffee, a young woman sat down next to him. She turned to the cowboy and asked, "Are you a real cowboy?" He replied, "Well, I've spent my whole life breaking colts, working cows, going to rodeos, fixing fences, pulling calves, baling hay, doctoring calves, cleaning my barn, fixing flats, working on tractors, and feeding my dogs, so I guess I am a cowboy." She said, "I'm a sin. I spend my whole day thinking about women. As soon as I get up in the morning, I think about women. When I shower, I think about women. When I watch TV, I think about women. It seems everything makes me think of women." The two sat sipping in silence. A little while later, a man sat down on the other side of the old cowboy and asked, "Are you a real cowboy?" He replied, "I always thought I was, but I just found out I'm a sin." A passenger piled his luggage on the scale at an airline counter in New York and said to the ticket agent, "I'm flying to Los Angeles. I want the large bag sent to Denver and the 2 small ones to Cincinnati." "I'm sorry, sir, but we can't do that," said the ticket agent. "That's good to hear because that's where they ended up the last time I flew this route." Two blondes were exiting a restaurant when they discovered, to their horror, that they locked their keys in their car. The one blonde says to the other, "What do we do? Do we get a coat hanger and pick the lock?" The other one replied, "No, people will think we're trying to break in." The other one said, "Well, do we get a knife and cut the rubber and pop the lock?" The other one answered, "No, people will think we're too stupid to use the coat hanger." The other one said, "Well, we better think of something quick because it's starting to rain and the sunroof is open." On some air bases, the Air Force is on one side of the field and civilian aircraft use the other side of the field, with the control tower in the middle. One day the tower received a call from an aircraft asking, "What time is it?" The tower responded, "Who is calling?" The aircraft replied, "What difference does it make?" The tower replied, "It makes a lot of difference. If it is an American Airlines flight, it is 3 o'clock. If it is an Air Force plane, it is 1,500 hours. If it is a Navy aircraft, it is 6 bells. If it is an Army aircraft, the big hand is on the 12 and the little hand is on the 3. If it is a Marine Corps aircraft, it's Thursday afternoon." A woman tired of the dating scene and desperate for a decent boyfriend put a personal ad in the paper. The ad read, "Wanted, a good man that won't beat me, won't run around on me, and good in bed." The next day, her doorbell rang. She answered the door to find a man with no arms and no legs sitting in a wheelchair. He told her that he was there in response to her ad. She asked, "What makes you think you will be a good fit?" He replied, "I don't have arms, so I can't beat you, and I don't have legs, so I can't run around on you." She then asked, "Are you any good in bed?" He replied, "I rang the doorbell." A man applies for a government job. A guy goes into the post office to apply for a job. The interviewer asks him, "Are you allergic to anything?" He replies, "Yes, caffeine. I can't drink coffee." "Okay, have you ever been in the military service?" "Yes," he says, "I was in Afghanistan for one tour." The interviewer says, "That will give you extra points toward employment." Then he asks, "Are you disabled in any way?" The man says, "Yes, a bomb exploded near me and I lost both my testicles." The interviewer is shocked, but assures the man that his disability qualifies him for extra points. "You got the job, sir. Most of us come in at 8 a.m., but you can start tomorrow at 10 a.m. "Why do I get to start late?" asked the man. "This is a government job. For the first couple hours we just drink coffee. No point in you coming in for that." A police officer pulls over this guy who had been weaving in and out of the lanes. He goes up to the guy's window and says, "Sir, I need you to blow into this breathalyzer tube." The man says, "Sorry officer, I can't do that. I am an asthmatic. If I do that I'll have a really bad asthma attack." "Okay, fine," sighs the officer. "I need you to come down to the station to give a blood sample." "I can't do that either. I am a hemophiliac," says the man. "If I do that, I'll bleed to death." "Well, then we need a urine sample." "I'm sorry officer, I can't do that either. I am also a diabetic. If I do that I'll get really low blood sugar." "Alright, then I need you to come out here and walk this white line." "I can't do that, officer." "Why not?" "Because I'm too drunk." One Friday night, Patrick went up to his friend Patty and said, "Patty, I need a favor. I'm sleeping with the bartender's wife. Can you hold him in the pub for an hour after he closes up?" Patty was not very fond of the idea, but being Patrick was a lifelong friend, he reluctantly agreed. After the pub closed, Patty struck up a conversation with the bartender, asking him all sorts of stupid questions in an effort to keep him occupied. After some time, the bartender became suspicious and asked, "Patty, what are you really up to with all this? Patty, filled with feelings of guilt and remorse, confessed to the bartender and said, "I'm sorry, my friend Patrick is sleeping with your wife right now and asked me to keep you occupied." The bartender smiled, then put a brotherly hand on Patty's shoulder, before saying, "I think you'd better hurry home. My wife died 2 years ago." Hey there, I put a lot effort into making these videos, so please subscribe for more jokes and stay happy.